and get started. First, thank you everyone for coming in person or online. I'm delighted that we have such nice turnout for this event. This event is entitled Mapping Inequality, Reckoning with, I forget the subtitle, Reckoning with Racial Covenants, the History of Racially Restrictive Covenants and Their Ongoing Effects, or something to that effect. My name is Elizabeth Aaliyah. I teach property and land use regulation classes here at UNM. And I want to first thank the Natural Resources and Environmental Law Committee and the Environmental Law Society for co-hosting this wonderful event that's going to be really informative. And I also want to thank our presenters, who I'll introduce in just a moment. To give you a sense of what we're going to be talking about this afternoon, there's a common misconception that segregation in America today is simply based on personal preference, what's called de facto segregation. People just choose to live among their own race, ethnicity, religion, whatever category you want to describe. Journalists and academics have been challenging this misconception for decades by telling the story of how Depression era and New Deal era federal mortgage insurance programs, among other federal programs, but especially those mortgage insurance programs, including the Homeowners Loan Corporation during the Great Depression, the Federal Housing Administration, the Public Housing Administration, and the Veterans Administration during the New Deal, actively financed the development of suburban development across the United States, and in so doing, explicitly promoted the exclusion and even geographic confinement of Blacks and other racial minorities throughout their underwriting criteria and their manuals that explained how to set up these financing structures. Our panelists today are going to guide us through these federal mortgage insurance programs and the pervasive redlining and racially restrictive covenants that they encouraged throughout the United States. And we'll trace these patterns of discrimination forward to examine the ongoing forms of discrimination that we see in land use patterns today and regulation today that flow from these early federal programs. Our panelists today, I'm excited to say, are Robert Nelson. Robert is the director of the Digital Scholarship Lab and the head of digital engagement in the Boatwright Library at the University of Richmond. He's the editor of American Panorama, an atlas of the United States history, which includes mapping inequality, redlining, and New Deal America. That's what he'll focus on today. American Panorama received the 2019 Roy Rosenzweig Prize for Innovation in Digital History from the American Historical Association and was named a tech innovation by the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2016. Dr. Nelson also teaches courses about slavery and anti-slavery in the United States and courses related to the digital humanities. Our second presenter is going to be Diana Dorn-Jones, the executive director of United South Broadway, one of Albuquerque's oldest nonprofit community development corporations, which currently provides statewide foreclosure counseling and civil legal services to homeowners facing loss of their homes in the New Mexico courts. Diana is a founding member of the Project Change Fair Lending Center and the Anti-Racism Institute of the Southwest. She has organized community groups to implement the Community Reinvestment Act, bringing millions of dollars into the state for low-income housing and small business development. Diana is a lifelong Albuquerque resident and former chief operating officer of the city of Albuquerque. And I want to give Diana a special thank you and acknowledgement. She was able to join us on very short notice because Stefan Scott was unable to join us today based on an unforeseen situation. So thank you so much, Diana. We're eternally grateful and can't wait to hear your presentation and talk with you. Our third presenter will be Michaela Rentz-Whitmore. Michaela is the long-range planning manager for the city of Albuquerque, where she's active in the visioning process of the city, working with community organizations, developing skills building workshops, and updating the city's integrated development ordinance, which is our zoning code. So, so those will be our presentations. We're going to have each presenter speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. Each one has a PowerPoint slide that they want to share with you. And then we're going to open it up for general questions. You can send me comments if you want in the chat through Zoom, or just hold on to them if you're here in person, and you'll be able to fire away. Okay, great. That being said, I'm going to turn it over to Rob, who's going to take it away.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm delighted to be able to join you virtually. I make a huge number of presentations on redlining. This is actually my second one that I'm making today. And usually I find myself at a conference center or some university auditorium in a city that has a redlining map, and I can begin my presentation by throwing this 80-plus-year-old map up on the screen and talk about the history of racial discrimination on the landscape. You know, when people leave the conference center doors or the university hall or whatever. And I can't do that tonight. And one of the reasons is I'm 2 time zones away from you, obviously, regrettably, because of this pandemic, but also because the most infamous archive of redlining, that made by the Homeowners Loan Corporation between 1935 and 1940, they did not create a redlining map for Albuquerque. They didn't make one for any city in New Mexico. They restricted their map making program to cities with populations of 40,000 or more, and I looked it up. The population of Albuquerque exploded. I'm sure you guys are all aware of this in the 40s and 50s, but in the 1930s it was 1930 it was about 25,000 and past 30,000 sometime during the decade. So I thought, like, okay, what's this presentation about? So what I want to do tonight is really briefly is think about the value of the Holk Archive and thinking about the history of racial discrimination in the residential housing market in a city that we don't have a map for. That's one question. And then I want to think, what do I want to think? I brought these questions up. And I want to think about how you understand the geographic contours of a place that doesn't have a whole map when you want to think about spatialized racism in that place. So let me offer a few thoughts, and I am going to start with a Polk map. So let me share my screen here. I'll share it, start with a map for one of the few cities in the Southwest that they did map. And this is the map of Phoenix, Arizona. And I'll be really brief. All these maps look pretty similar to Polk. They had I mean, that was one of the pernicious things, is they were nationalizing these standards. And what they wanted to do is measure the residential security of neighborhoods in cities large and small across the US. And by residential security, we're thinking about the relative security and relative risk to mortgage lenders in extending mortgage capital into certain neighborhoods. And they graded neighborhoods on a scale of A to D. This actually mapped there, I'll zoom in on that. The A they described as best, B still desirable, C definitely declining, and D is hazardous. And they gave them 4 colors: green, blue, yellow, red, and like a kind of a mnemonic, I guess, or it's not a mnemonic, but a kind of an analogy for this is to think of this like a traffic light. Traffic light not for moving through an intersection, but for extending mortgage capital. A green grade meant they deemed this to be a safe risk, where a sound mortgage lender or bank wouldn't hesitate, you know, given adequate income from an applicant, to extend mortgage there, because that house was going to retain its value over the duration of that 25, 30-year investment. On the other hand, red neighborhoods, like a traffic light, were meant to signal stop, that this was a hazard, and that a sound, responsible lender wouldn't extend that capital, that mortgage credit. And then between them, this yellow light means to exercise some caution, to give it some additional thought. maybe proceed cautiously, but maybe to hedge your bets, maybe extend less capital, maybe just don't extend capital. All right, so these maps and the kind of spatial data available on our site have been used like incredibly creative ways by researchers, activists, a few policymakers. And they do this because, I mean, frankly, there's just not a kind of more convenient data set covering as many cities for analyzing 20th century racial discrimination, the housing market and its legacies. It kind of become, in that respect, a proxy for systemic and structural racism, particularly as it was advanced by the federal government. And the other reason they're kind of really powerful is that they, especially for presentation purposes, for persuasion purposes, you just take a little scratch at some of the textual data behind here. Into 21st century ears, they are shockingly direct in expressing their racist, nativist, and anti-Semitic biases. I have to say, there is no subtext here. There is just text, and they are direct and unambiguous about not just expressing, but trumpeting, championing racism, nativism, anti-Semitism as best practice in the real estate market and in housing policy at mid-century. And let me just give you a couple very quick examples of this from, I'm using that here. So this is D4 on the southwest of Phoenix. And what they wrote about this is this section lying outside the city limits is very ragged, occupied by Mexican, Negroes, and the low caste of white people. There's no sale for property herein. And that's all they say about it, right? Like this is the basis for this grade, is that, they don't say anything about the buildings, they don't say anything about property values. They point at some racialized categories of the occupants. And in the class of some white occupants there, Mexicans and African Americans living there. And this is the case everywhere. If the presence of African Americans, 3 families, 2 families, sometimes that's adequate enough to redline a neighborhood. I will give one more example. Well, on the other side, we will look at A1, I think they're all the same. Okay, and this, let's jump up to this. This is considered the best and most exclusive residential district in Phoenix. The northern half is known as Encanto, and the southern half is oh yeah, this is the last line is, or second to last. This area is highly restricted, which is that, like, they're very much view restrictive covenants, which Diane will be talking more about as a plus that warrants a high grade. Neighborhoods almost always need to have restrictive covenants built into them to warrant that grade. Okay, so back to the questions. So if you don't have a redlining map for a city, does that mean like a city like Albuquerque did not have redlining? And that it definitely does not mean that. In fact, Elizabeth mentioned this, Holk is not the primary practitioner of redlining in the 1930s or 40s, 50s, or 60s. In the federal government, that would be the Federal Housing Administration that practiced redlining through the mortgage insurance. It extended to some places and to some people, and chose not to extend to other places and other people for basically a half century until the passage of the Fair Housing Act, and arguably for years past the Fair Housing Act. And they had their own maps, but they destroyed them in 1969 after the passage of the Fair Housing Act and amid some litigation that they were facing for their discriminatory practices. So we don't have that archive. But with some painstaking work, it's often possible to uncover the geography of the mortgage insurance that they extended. There's a recent paper by Price Fishback, Jonathan Rose, Kenneth A. Snowden, and Thomas Storrs that has done this for 3 cities in the 1930s. And I'm throwing them up here, Greensboro, Baltimore, and Peoria. And what they did is they went through county level records of mortgages, and they plotted which sites got FHA guarantees and which did not. And The results match up not perfectly, but really closely to the redlining grades developed by Hope, which is not to say they really want to emphasize this point that FHA wasn't using the Holk maps, but they were using essentially the same racist segregationist logic and the same basic underlying data on ethnicities and race to make these decisions. And so no wonder with the same priorities and the same data, they come up with the same results, which is to channel public and private capital to some neighborhoods, white, middle class neighborhoods, usually on the periphery of cities in emerging suburbs, and to deny that to neighborhoods of color and many poor white neighborhoods as well. Another strategy, which Diane will talk about, is to map restricted covenants, and that's another painstaking way of going through deeds to figure out and document and show the landscape of racism in real estate practice in the 20th century. And then finally, this is kind of an obvious one, but it's an incredibly important source, which is oral histories. So I just quickly took a look at the University of New Mexico Black Alumni Oral History Collection, which looks really great. And I think I was probably like 15 minutes into just peeking through it before I found some very brief, but nevertheless kind of revealing information about segregation and housing in Albuquerque. This was from an oral history of Harold Bailey, who holds 3 degrees from UNM, and he was reflecting on housing restraints that his family faced when they moved to Albuquerque in the 1940s. And I'm going to quote him. He said, African Americans could not live in certain neighborhoods. Matter of fact, even if you had enough money, you cannot buy a home in Northeastern Heights. Even though we had a little money, not a lot of money, we were kind of isolated to the South Broadway area and the Kirkland addition. That's why most of the African Americans lived there. So it was kind of discrimination on the housing. And then the interviewer asked, do you remember your parents ever talking about those challenges as they were house hunting for the family? And he replied, they discussed it, but it was just reality. We just decided to live in South Broadway area in the Kirkland addition. So like these kind of, this is really brief, obviously, he doesn't go into depth, but these kinds of sources are particularly important because they don't just get at the wheres and the whens of racial discrimination, but they can get at the kind of effective psychological impact that it has on people that were victimized by these practices. Okay, the final thing I want to say. So these are all routes to exploring one particular form of spatial or racialized racism, one that's really incredibly important, and that is the racism in the real estate market and in real estate practice and government housing policy during the mid-20th century. But there are obviously others that are essential too in seeing, analyzing, understanding, and trying to repair spatial racism. Some of those examples, school segregation and zoning, citing of environmental burdens, industrial plants and environmental benefits, parks, highway routing and the displacement that attended it, urban renewal, food apartheid, policing, gentrification, et cetera, et cetera. Given the ubiquity of spatialized racism in the US, there are regrettably far too many opportunities and ways to map inequality. With that, I will say thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. Awesome. Okay, excellent. Let's see. Okay. All right, thank you so much. And we're gonna now pivot right over to Diana Dorn-Jones for your presentation. Diana, I will launch your PowerPoint from here. So bear with me for just a second. And I'll mute myself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diana. And first, I just want to disclose and just kind of, as Elizabeth mentioned, Stefan Scott is not able to join us tonight. And I can tell you right now, he's not happy about that because this is his work that I'm kind of presenting to you. but he's a good friend of mine, and we can call on each other at the very last moment to cover for each other. So I'm kind of your second hand here, bringing Stefan's work to you. Some of the work that he's presenting we'll go over pretty quickly. Others of it, because some of it gets a little bit too detailed, but we want to cover as much as we can. I'm delighted to share his work with you tonight because Stefan and I met about 15 years ago, and we were looking at issues of institutional racism. And of course, as many of you know, housing is one of the most racialized issues in America. Where you live and who you live among is really a big thing in terms of housing in this country. I have a bit of an affinity to housing because I do that for a living right now, help people save their homes. But in another life, I was also a commercial lender in some of the largest banks in this country. And so I know what it means, redlining. I understand how underwriting works because I did some of that. And I saw some things that were pretty disturbing over the course of my career there. So my work in the nonprofit world is to help people to avoid predatory lending practices, as well as avoiding bad loans and taking advice from others who are steering them in the wrong direction around one of the most major purchases they'll ever make. So if we could go to the next page. So this is Stefan, and I just want you to see his lovely face because he's a wonderful young man. Scott, Mr. Scott, he has a master's. Stefan has a master's in public administration. And the information tonight comes from his paper that's entitled Whites Only. And it's about a racially restrictive real estate covenants in New Mexico, Albuquerque to be specific. And he earned an award for this, the Farrell Hetty Award for Most Outstanding Professional Paper. His work was also previewed by Larry Barker not too long ago, where they did some interviews and looking at racial covenants. So next one, objectives. We're not going to cover all of these things, but the things that I think are important are the racially restrictive covenants. And because a lot of this actually took place, racial covenants kind of came into being when there was a mass migration of African Americans out of the rural South, moving north, seeking opportunities in the north. And so as you migrate, they stopped along the way in different places from the rural South going north. And you can imagine some people stopped and some lived in different cities as they moved on. So as Black people began to show up in these communities, things began to change a little bit. Where will they live? So we're also going to talk a little bit about how segregation resulted in New Mexico and these covenants and what it resulted in our community, and then explore a little bit of the impacts of housing discrimination. Next. These really are anti-racism terms that Stefan lays out. So for those of us who study these issues, we know them pretty well. Artie, the Anti-Racism Institute of the Southwest that I work with and do trainings for people, we spend a lot of time in our workshops exploring and unpacking some of these terms so we have a full understanding. But clearly, as we talk about real estate and living in residential communities, we're looking at redlining, which is a systemic denial to withhold income, home loans, and getting insurance for people of color. So it's about access to credit and capital so that you could buy homes. And then steering. A lot of the steering, even though legally we cannot discriminate based on race in real estate, there's a lot of work that's done by the real estate industry. Our organization did a lot of work with the Urban Institute once here in Albuquerque, looking at racial fair lending practices. And it was real clear that people were steering white people that we would send in as testers. They tell them, don't go past certain streets in this community. You don't want to go there if you're looking around. So it was happening and it's documented. The other term is de jure, an action that is officially sanctioned by policy or law. And then de facto, which Elizabeth talked about earlier, an action that is not officially sanctioned by law. These terms are really important when you discuss issues of real estate and racial covenants and just racialized housing in America. So what exactly, the next one, please, Elizabeth. So what exactly racial restrictive covenants? They're private agreements, usually presented as a clause within deeds or leases which restrict the occupancy or use of real estate property by non-whites. or two, of real estate to non-whites. So racial covenants were formed throughout the United States to achieve its segregationist policies, and those restrictive covenants shaped Albuquerque and shaped not just Albuquerque, but cities across the country, as Rob just showed you. Next. So I'll give you an example of Albuquerque here. Who can own property and who can actually reside in property is what these covenants were about. And basically they were to, no one could own property, a residential property, probably not even a commercial property, unless if they were descendants of any African background or Oriental races. That term, I hardly can say it Oriental and refer to a group of people because I say Oriental really is a furniture style. That's not a group of people. They're talking about Asians in this case. And in Albuquerque, we're probably talking about the railroad, because the railroad brought Asians to our community in many ways. So not only could African Americans and Asian people not own a property, they also couldn't occupy that space as a tenant. They couldn't rent it or it couldn't be leased to them, but they could be there if they're in servitude and allowed to serve the white people who did reside in those properties. Next. So I think Stevan here was showing you what it looked like in 1946, that red outline and kind of in the middle, and kind of Barry says a thin red line there. Thank you. That's kind of what it looked like where these covenants existed in early Albuquerque. But if we go to the next map, no, actually, it's not, the next map is not there. He wants to really, there's the map I want to see. Thank you. It really did spread quite a bit, didn't it? It spread across our cities in the 1940s, 50s, and real estate developers began to designate specific areas in this community for covenants. Could you go back one slide real quick to the, I just think there's a couple of things that are important in this whole timeline where you look at issues of race, it's history. And so you always want to kind of look at what happened, how did these things happen? So there's a couple of things that I think are really important. 1883 civil rights case, the government said, we can't prohibit discrimination. We can't tell people what to do. And then if you go down to 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, same kind of thing. It was all about who can get access to things and who cannot. And then if you go to 1936, the Fair Housing, the Federal Home Loan, FHA, underwriting manual was published, and that was all about redlining. And then in 1934, the FHA established underwriting criteria to actually say that we'll figure out a way to pencil people out of these areas by requiring that they check the box. If enough boxes are not checked, or too many boxes checked in the wrong direction, that will eliminate people from coming into the community. And then in 1957, this is the one that I know quite a bit about, and that's Levittown. Levittown was set up, housing was being built to accommodate soldiers coming in from the war and giving them a chance to create that middle class. Well, guess who wasn't allowed to have access to those loans, those FHA loans? Well, that was soldiers coming home that were of color. They did not have. And to me, this really leads to the wealth gap in this country. Who got started first? Who had access to what? And so therein started the wealth gap in this country, the division. So then in 1968, of course, the Fair Housing Act there. And we can talk a lot about that, but that's not necessary. We know that it has its pros and its cons. The next one, could you show that little chart, the little pie chart? Okay, so this is kind of how they had like 60 subdivisions that were kind of identified, and 31 of those, they had racial covenants, and 31 and all the 60 subdivisions. So it was spreading pretty well. And if you can notice here, a lot of that took place in the Northeast Heights. And we know that today, and that goes to the story that was just told about Harold Bailey's family. And by the way, I just want you to know I was born and raised in South Broadway, and I still live in South Broadway. I love this community. So as a matter of fact, it's being gentrified quite readily, and we're concerned about that. So then the next slide, please. These are exploring the impact of housing. These are really all social determinants of health. And so if you look at home equity, quality of housing, health, lifespan, education, employment opportunities, access to voting sites, access to nutritional foods and parks and places to recreate that are safe. Where you live makes a difference in the outcomes. And we know that the studies have been done. Your zip code can determine what will happen in your life going forward. So housing and where you live, how you live, and how you have access to that resource is extremely important for outcomes for people of color in particular. And so if you go to the next one, please. So the definition we talk about, steering by realtors, extremely important. They are and I have a lot of friends who are realtors, let me just make that statement, but I can tell you that this is where a lot of this work takes place. Who's pointing people to what parts of the city, where to live and where not to live. The same thing goes with redlining, denial of access to credit and capital or insurance in neighborhoods of color. So even if you were to get a home and in one of those areas that Rob had, if they're a rugged, raggedy area, you wouldn't be able to get a loan to even fix it up because they've already drawn that line around that community and there will be no money lent in those areas. And in terms of how segregated Albuquerque was as a result of racial covenants, if you look, there was like 85% of the neighborhoods in Albuquerque were racially segregated. In 1945, we were as segregated as Selma, Alabama. And that's really scary to me. So these covenants, pretty much, they stay forever. They're on the deed, they're tied to the deed. Sometimes they can be removed by a judicial process. In some states, these covenants can be deleted at the time the property changes hands. So if someone sells the property, you can ask that they be deleted, but that's in some states. However, that's not the case in New Mexico. I just think it's important to also let you know that there is legislation on the federal level that's pending right now to address this. And our Senator Heinrich signed on, but it's a Senate bill in Congress, Senate Bill 2549, and it was introduced by Tina Smith of Minnesota. But it also provides, and this is something for the university students that are on here, it provides $5 million in grants through the Office of Fair Housing and Equal Employment Opportunity between 2022 and 2031 to minority serving institutions like UNM to collaborate on developing a national database on historic housing discrimination records. So that's something that we might want to look at if we want to do this work. It's important. I want them to do a database because I think history is important, and it's not, what we don't want to do is erase history, because we don't get better if we don't know our history and where we need to go next. But that's an important piece that I think that we should do. And I think people, if you don't know the story of Levittown, the legacy of exclusion of people of color, it's classic. And I think you'll see just how the wealth gap gets created in America and how it kind of works. Elizabeth wanted to, and I agree with her, because as a banker, I did a lot of underwriting, but she really wants us to stress and know the importance of these deed restrictions, because quite frankly, and the terms that they use are really interesting. They use terms like protections from adverse influences. Would that be us, people of color? We're adverse influences. So it just wasn't good enough to use zoning codes to do that. They really wanted to institutionalize this issue. And so therefore you put it in the documents in this country that are long-term documents that take a huge lift to make a change. So because I do a lot of work in the area of institutional racism, and really that's what this is about. And people did choose not to live around people of color. They made a definite decision about that. But that's kind of the history of our country, and it goes way back, and it's more than this workshop. But let me just read you something about institutional racism. The reason to be institutionalized means that it has to be systematically structured and made legitimate by whites as the process by which housing would occur. Like all other policies, political institutions in the United States, it was structured by whites to benefit the self-interest of white people. Thus, when white people conform to the policies of the institutions which legitimize white superiority, they get privilege over Blacks and all other non-white people. These privileges are sanctioned by the law. So every institution in the United States is ultimately controlled by whites, from local governments to the national government, from local small banks, large federal banks, and reserve systems, from small health clinics to major hospitals and pharmaceutical firms. All the institutions in our country have systemic racism going on in them because they were created to exclude others. So despite the fact that the United States is a multicultural society, of all the institutions function to render greater benefits to white people. By never challenging the institutional policies, these grant them privileges over non-whites. White people maintain more human worth and social status than non-whites, and racism remains in place. Hence, in white societies, the institutions must function to legitimize and perpetuate white superiority without the sanctioning granted by the institutions. Individual conformity to white privilege would not be possible. So it was created by individuals and it's supported by the institutions in this country. We won't be rid of this until we begin to look at institutional racism, begin to undo racism in this country, because housing is a huge thing. And I think about the fact that we look at the wealth gap, and we certainly have been looking at it lately as it relates to COVID and the generations of income bearers and homes that are dying, and they're dying in the time when they are at their highest level to earn income, in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s. What will they pass on to their children? They will not pass on a home to their children in many cases. And therefore, we're going to just continue to exacerbate and carry on that whole history of not having equality. And as I like to say, that goes across all issues, the humanity that it takes to share the wealth of this country with others.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Diana, for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to try to pull up, while Michaela is speaking, I'll probably try to pull up those underwriting
Guidelines, yes.
Yeah, that'd be good. Okay, thank you so much. I'm now going to pass it over to Michaela Rentz-Whitmore for her presentation. And Michaela, let me make sure that you're able, I think you'll be able to access your PowerPoint. Let me know if you have a problem. We can probably just pull it up. Or if you do share screen, it should come up as one of your. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but you're not sharing your screen yet. So no. Yeah. Okay. All right, so my name is Michaela Rentz-Whitmore. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. My heart's beating very fast because how do you follow Diana Dorn-Jones? That was fabulous. So I'll give it my best shot. So I am a planner with the city of Albuquerque, and I want to just pause here and say, remember, Albuquerque has been home to people for as long as there have been people, right? In this area, and so. Albuquerque is one of the oldest cities in the US and has been continuously home for people making choices about how to live, where to live, and putting their own stamp on the built environment. And so my part of this story that we're telling tonight is the zoning piece. So zoning comes in after racial covenants and after redlining has already put that institutionally racist and systemic racist stamp on our city in Albuquerque, cities throughout the US, but we also have this added layer of institutional racism and genocide in that we here in Albuquerque are coming into a place where Native peoples had been continuously present in our pueblos for thousands of years. So the zoning piece of it, our very first zoning code in the city of Albuquerque that stuck, we tried a couple times in the 1920s, and I'm going to say we because I work at the city of Albuquerque. I would love to give myself distance from some of the institutional racism that happens at the city, but I'm part of the institution and part of that history as well. So you'll hear me say we, and I mean the city.
So the city adopted our first zoning code that stuck in 1959. Think about how late that is in the history of Albuquerque. So railroad came in the 1880s, right? Bringing Asian people, bringing Black people, bringing white people coming in from the East Coast. And so I imagine a bunch of white guys, because I'm sure it was a bunch of white guys, standing around a map, asking themselves, what shall we paint here in these areas? Which zone should we put on which areas? And of course, they're coming in with that same legacy of bias and that same legacy of bigotry and hatred that Rob talked about in the beginning. And so you see our city limits in 1959, they come in with an off-the-shelf zoning code, had nothing to do with Albuquerque. It was a zoning code that was being adopted by most cities that were kind of adopting zoning at the time. And they said, oh, okay, well, R1 means single family. So that neighborhood with mostly white people is single family. So they're going to get R1. And that neighborhood over there has some apartments and some duplexes and probably wasn't mostly white people. And well, we're going to give them multifamily zoning. And that area along the railroad looks industrial to me. Of course, that area along the railroad also had worker housing, right? Because that's who lived there and that's what they were doing. They were working on at the rail yards, for example. But here come these white professional planners doing a zoning code for the first time. And of course, they're looking at that map and saying, yes, but what's going to be there along the railroad is going to be industrial activity, because what else is going to go in next to a railroad? And suddenly you get a bunch of industrial zoning on top of land where people are living, right? Environmental justice kind of being set in law, the law of zoning from that moment. And so the city actually adopts a second zoning code, completely replaces the first in the 1970s, but it's not really much better. Still off the shelf zoning codes, still kind of, they just looked at what other cities were adopting and kind of adopted it here. And that's the zoning code that we just kept amending hundreds of times between 1975 and 2018 when we took the step of completely redoing everything. And you can see the city had kind of grown a little bit more by the 1970s. So zoom forward a little bit more. And what we recognized kind of from the beginning was that this off-the-shelf zoning code, which was very auto-oriented, if any of you have taken Elizabeth's law class, you know that it was very Euclidean, meaning it separated out uses, right? Residences go here, commercial goes there. That is not how Albuquerque was kind of operating before that time, by the way, but zoning helps really force that issue so that you can no longer use your property in whatever way you want. Now there are laws saying, the zoning laws saying, if you're a residential zone, you cannot put a business there, right? So mom and pop stores that you live above, not anymore, not within a Euclidean zoning code. But look at Old Town, right? Old Town's a 300-year-old place stamped by a different culture. If you take a different law class, you can learn about our Spanish colonial laws. They had a different system, different kind of zoning, a different kind of pattern that they stamped in Old Town with the church at one end, a plaza in the middle, blah, blah, blah. So right away, the city started adopting little zoning codes with some policies in them that said, okay, citywide, those rules might work, but here we're going to make different rules to make sure that Old Town stays Old Town. It doesn't get literally paved over by an auto-oriented zoning code. So there was a little sector plan just for Old Town, and it said, here are some policies and here's the zoning, and the things that you look around Old Town and see, that's what's allowed here and not anything different. That worked pretty well for Old Town. So let's also do that for some from historic neighborhoods at the core. And you can kind of see from the eras on this map that the sector plans kind of proliferated out from the historic neighborhoods that had been developed and built out kind of, I'm going to say more organically than before the zoning was established, and kind of we kept adopting more and more and more and more sector plans as they went out. And the purpose of sector plans kind of shifted over time because communities saw, hey, I get a chance to have my voice. I get to help develop policy. I get to help develop the zoning that's going to protect the character of my area. Fantastic. But you also still have fairly racist folks who say, oh, that's a tool that I can use to push out the uses that I don't want. That's the tool that I can use to make sure that only really big lots are allowed in the far Northeast Heights, right? Making sure that you can't get affordable housing in certain areas. So it's another tool, again, not racially restrictive covenants, but now built into, oh, it's just lot size. That has nothing to do with race, right? Except that we know de facto it absolutely has everything to do with race. As Diana Dorn-Jones mentioned, housing is all about what people consider to be racial, right? And so a system that started as a really good thing was also had some negative and institutionally racist outcomes. So you get to 2018 and you look at a map of the city, and only about half of the city was regulated by an auto-oriented off-the-shelf zoning code. And about half the city was regulated by some combination of sector development plan zoning or an overlay, which is also kind of like a little mini zoning code, special rules for a special place that lie on top of the zoning code. That as a system isn't a system that's working. It's a system that is all one-off. And when everything's one-off, how do you maintain what can happen on a property? And so when the city went to think about what we replace our zoning code with, we had to ask ourselves, what makes a good zoning system? What are we aiming for here? And in the ideal, a zoning system is good when you know what rules apply on a particular property. It's easy to understand, as easy to understand as law can be. It's as easy to understand what rules apply on this particular property and what don't. You also want zoning rules that establish kind of a baseline of high quality development citywide, and special rules for special places that protect character, protect our public investment in open space, let's say. We also kind of by policy want to make sure that it's easier to develop where we can absorb that growth with investment we've made in infrastructure and libraries and community centers, and harder to grow where we don't want to grow, on our edges, let's say. Do we want to sprawl forever, or do we want to pull growth into centers of activity where we've already invested and people already need goods and services? We also want to make sure that people have input about development that's going to affect them. So that amount of input and community voice has to also be baked into the system. And lastly, we want to make sure that there's a little bit of flexibility in the zoning code to acknowledge the fact that the world's not actually flat. Most parcels aren't actually square, right? And you may have to have a little bit of wiggle room to actually get a development project off the ground. So what we inherited when we went to go create the integrated development ordinance was a system from the 1970s with about 20 what I'm going to call straight zones, R1, C1, M1, about 60 sector development plans that totaled up had about 400 unique zones, and then a bunch of what we called SU1 site plan controlled zones. What that meant was a property owner would come to the city and say, and would say, I would like a special zone just for me. Here's the development standards I want. Here's the uses I want. And they would negotiate with both the city, and the public would be part of that process, to create their own unique site plan controlled zone. I hope you can imagine that that's a force for both good and bad, right? That was a great way to give a lot of powers to the neighborhoods to negotiate about what they wanted to live next to, and to ask for mitigation for things that seemed negative to them in terms of impact. It was also used as a way to push out, not here, not there, not there, not there, any uses that neighbors with power, neighbors with privilege, neighbors with bias had to say not here, right? We call that NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyard. You remember my slide, over half actually a quarter of the properties in the city before we replaced everything were SU1. Many of those were not here, not here, not here, not here, not here, not here kind of zones. New system, we still want to be able to protect special places. We still want to be able to have special rules that protect character, that protect history, that make sure that the development that's happening doesn't bring industry closer to residential, right? We still want to bake all those tools in. So the integrated development ordinance has all of those zoning tools in it, but it's all in one book. It's easy to find what rules apply on a particular property. It's now tied in with a zoning map that you can actually look up what applies where. To do that, I'm just going to try to go really fast. I know I'm out of time, but just imagine what we had to kind of go through, that we had to replace all those SU1 zones with something that's about equivalent, because we couldn't, people have property rights. Constitution says people have property rights, and the property owner needs due process, and the city can't remove all value from their property. And so in doing this big trick of going from a system of, you know, however many zones that last slide totaled, to something that's one book with a lot of nuance in it, we had to have rules. What does one zone turn into? R1 turns into R1. That one was fairly easy. But what does each one of those SU1s turn into? What does each one of those unique sector plan zones turn into? So we created a zoning map tool where you could compare what was to what was proposed. And then we went through the hair pulling out process of saying, okay, what's one for one? And if you look in the integrated development ordinance right now, there's a table in there that says old zoning code, new zoning code, one for one, about what it is. We also had that opportunity to add some policy that actually tied our comprehensive plan to our zoning code to say, we want to encourage centers and corridors. We actually want our zoning to implement the community vision of not always sprawling on our edges, but pulling that development into centers and corridors. So you'll see for C2, for example, east of the river, C2, which was a purely commercial zone, turned into a mixed use zone, so that we can get some of that fabric back of living and working in the same place, living close to where you get services, for example, or where you work. West of the river, where the market wants to do residential, 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 and guess what happens in the morning and in the evening? Everybody's commuting across the river to come to the jobs on the east side. Reverse of that at night, everybody's staying in traffic to cross that river again to go home. So we wanted to make sure that the zoning in that case reflected a purely non-residential zone, so that we didn't just feed the market for residential on the west side. Then imagine we took all of those SU1 properties and said, one for one, what's it going to turn into? And we had a series of rules, which I'm not going to go into. I'm happy to answer questions about them, but we had to like think through if then, if this, then here's the conversion. This little table of SU1 zones goes on for 54 pages. It's 13,000 properties. It's 770 unique zone names. They're not even unique. They're not, when I say zone category, we had multiple versions of SU1 for C1 plus something. It was a lot of nuance, trust me. Then we had to go through SU2 and SU3 conversions. These are sector plan zones. And so this list, again, what was it in the sector plan? What does it turn into in the new system? Goes on for 23 pages, not quite as bad, only about 400 unique zones. But again, we're just one for one, zone for zone. So the institutional racism that was built in from the beginning and baked in from the beginning is being perpetuated here. I'm being upfront about that. So we're left with a new zoning map, great, but we know we've just done zone for zone. We know that in some circumstances, the zoning that has always been there did not match the land use, right? We know that some white planners in the 1950s looked at along the railroads and zoned residential industrial zones. And so the city said, okay, we need a second round of these conversions that can address some of the problems that we know are on the ground. And we made it optional. If you as the property owner want to fix these problems, come in and we'll help. We'll be the applicant. We'll take it all the way through. We'll make sure that city council can act on your request. And so for a year, we took applications, sent them through in batches. First batch was only 140 people. Second batch, sorry, it was 140 properties. Second batch, a little more. Third batch, a little less. And moving on, addressing lots of problems. This is the bottom line. Not many people knew about it, despite all of our best intentions and all of our advertising, everything we did to get the word out. Not many people took advantage of it or didn't know about it. And so we fixed about 2% of the properties in the city of Albuquerque. So we know there's still a lot of issues out there. The other kind of thing that I want to call attention to, and then I'll kind of come to a close. The biggest issue that got fixed for these 2% of properties is a down zone from a zone that allowed either multifamily or allowed mixed use to something that only allowed single family. In the areas that are already segregated, the Northeast Heights, which is overwhelmingly white, these down zones perpetuate a whites only, single family only, wealth only pattern. In the downtown core, where you have more diversity, particularly in Martineztown, that down zone from a mixed use zone to a single family zone was actually a way that those folks can now build wealth in their single family homes. So zoning can be a power for good and a tool for evil, right? Mixed bag. So despite this legacy and this history of racially restrictive covenants and the institutional racism that kept that going in the first zoning systems, we're now asking ourselves, how do we over time do better? And we want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on tying our planning, our policies, and our zoning together, making sure that our zoning tools have both good citywide rules and special rules for special places. And then we want to make sure that we're actually working with communities, with community development corporations too, that are really doing the heavy lifting of making things better in their communities. So the city wants to work in all of the areas of Albuquerque, starting with those who really need some immediate attention first, and then make recommendations that can update our policy document and then update our integrated development ordinance or our zoning code, keep those documents updated over time so that we don't leave some communities behind. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you so much. Okay, I'd like to give all of our presenters a round of applause. Thank you so very much. It's so informative. There's so much to talk about in all of these. Why don't I first open it up for questions. If you're here in person, you can just raise your hand. If you're on Zoom, then you can drop your question into the chat, or you can raise your hand on the chat feature and I think unmute you. That would be fine too. So actually, yeah, if you want to just raise your hand on the chat, that would be easier probably, and then I'll unmute you. So anybody want to kick it off here? Or on Zoom? Oh, fantastic. Yes, please.
Ones that were approved, what measures in those conversions are actually bad?
Before you answer that question, I'm going to ask you to step up here to answer that question, and I will I'll ask you to reiterate the question if you don't mind once you're here. So we had a question from somebody in the in-person audience. I want to make sure that the folks on Zoom heard it. So Michaela will address it.
Awesome. And I may need clarification on the question too. So basically the question is, since 2018, or maybe even of the conversions that happened, how did they combat structural racism or institutional racism? And then since that, you're also kind of asking the question, since then, like zone changes that happen from there on, how do they help things?
Yes, how they help us, and also what are the major criteria that you look at?
What are the major criteria that we look at for zoning conversions? And so, yeah, the ones that happened for 2018, and I kind of skipped over this slide, so my apologies, but we were really trying to fix what we knew were problems, and not necessarily racial, institutional racism problems. But for example, there were properties that have what we call a floating zone line, which means one property but two zones on it for lots of historic reasons. And so we said, if that's you, come in, tell us which zone you want, and we'll pretty much give it to you, although we did do some analysis of what's around it. And if you were asking for something that would push more density, more intensity closer to single family neighborhoods or purely residential neighborhoods, we kind of, not so much. We also address things like the voluntary downzone, I think, is the most interesting. So there were kind of two ways that that happened on the ground. So either in the old zoning code, a zone like R2 allowed both multifamily and single family to happen. Just you could do any of those, that was fine. And so people with single family, that if single family got built out, people thought, oh, I have R1 because I have single family and so does everyone around me. But they actually always had R2 zoning. And so when we matched zone to zone in the first conversion, we said, oh, that's R2, that's a similar multifamily zone in the new zoning code. And so they got the IDO version of multifamily and they said, what? Why are you zoning us multifamily? We're not multifamily, we're single family, can't you see? We're like, yes, yes, we can see, but zoning is different from land use. And we've given you zone to zone. So the voluntary downzone allowed them to voluntarily downzone themselves from basically what was R2 to R1. And as I mentioned, sometimes that actually made institutional and structural racism worse in areas that are already very segregated. And in some areas, it made things better by taking away some of the development pressure in areas like Martineztown with very small lots, where what the market wants to do is consolidate lots, tear down that small house that's been there for 100 years, and put in its place an apartment building and start raising rents that start putting displacement pressure on the rest of the neighborhood. And so by rezoning to single family, you start pushing away that development pressure that now can't make that shift. Does that make sense? Is that enough of an answer, or were you wanting something different? Okay, sure. And Diana, if you want to add to that, please do. Do you want me to just stay up here?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I think Michaela is accurate. The change in the zoning code clearly took us hit us with a loop. As she said, it wasn't a lot of notification. The community didn't feel like they had an opportunity to get involved. And we lost what we thought were the important piece for us, because sector plans really are the only resident-driven planning document, rank 3 planning document that has any teeth, that protects our neighborhoods. So there, I think it's just, I mean, Michaela, I mean, we have to just be honest, there's been a lot of controversy around the IDO. There are some people who didn't even know it exists, period. Even people in the real estate community. So, and then I think that, and there's been lawsuits, there have been complaints, civil rights complaints. And I think that I'm not against change, but I am all about community engagement, authentic community engagement. And I think that anyone would say that a civil rights complaint that was filed and even given consideration by the Trump administration, because they weren't looking at any civil rights complaints, they actually gave us an opportunity, said that there were some issues around this in terms of language, access to information. And so, and I don't blame Michaela because she works for the city of Albuquerque and it's not her job. It's not her. The city of Albuquerque's city council actually is in charge of the zoning in Albuquerque by charter. So I just think I think that when we take on projects in communities of color, particularly in a place like New Mexico, where the majority minority, if you add up all the minority populations, that's majority, that there's, and especially since we're also a poverty state, we have high rates of poverty. We run 47, 48, 49, race to the bottom all the time. So that's the reality of what's going on here. And while I appreciate what Michaela is laying out, I just think it probably would have worked a lot better had there been a more thoughtful, engaging, and authentic approach to these changes. Because I can tell you, Martineztown, Santa Barbara is not at all happy about this. That's a little neighborhood. It's a village. It still remains kind of like a village. Small lots that run perpendicular to the acequias. And so, you know, I do think that the way people live and their history of how they live has to be honored. And I'm not so sure that's happening. And I also think that our old neighborhoods in the historic downtown, we're a little bit different than a lot of cities around the rail yard. In many cities I've traveled to, because when I go visit cities, I say, and they tell me, oh, what a great city they have. I said, you know what? Take me to your neighborhoods. Take me to your own neighborhoods. I'll tell you what kind of city you have, okay? Because some of the pattern looks the same. But so our neighborhoods are different around the old downtown core because they're not, in many cities, it's like a burned out donut around the rail yards. In our city, there's really vibrant old neighborhoods that have been here for a long time. And so my personal kind of thing is that I took a lot of time to learn the zoning code. And I was the representative for my neighborhood around variances. We never lost a case because we involved the community and brought them out to have their voice heard. But at the same time, I also think that, as my mother said, who was a houser, she was a houser. As soon as poor people learn how to play the game, the rules get changed. And so now we have a whole set of rules that everybody's got to change. And it's really kind of unsettling, but human beings are pretty resilient. And I think we'll find a way to let it all settle down and things will happen or not happen. And I just only hope it's for the good of the people in our communities, particularly low-income people of color.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, that other perspective on the issue. And thank you for the great question, Mara. I want to move on to a few more questions. I see two in the chat from Todd Quinn, and Professor Benson in the back had a question. So Rita, I'm going to go with Todd Quinn's questions first, if that's okay with you. The first question from Todd Quinn is, I assume all these zoning issues are happening in every city. Is it harder for large cities? I'm not sure which of our panelists feels like they want to tackle that. So I'll open it up to anybody who wants to jump in and say, do these types of rezoning or kind of reworking your zoning code challenges, especially those that are designed to address calcified racist land use practices from the mid 20th century and earlier, is it even harder in a larger city? Any opinions or thoughts about that?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that question. I do know that Minneapolis had some success in just getting rid of R1 altogether and saying what we really should have are zones that allow little duplexes and maybe accessory dwelling units and other things that stopped some of the exclusionary housing practices that they were seeing in the R1 zone. City in Portland did city in Oregon did the same thing. So I don't know if size has much to do with it. I feel like political will has a lot to do with it. I feel like the courage of decision makers to face this legacy of the past and intentionally do better. I liked that quote in your presentation, Diana Dorn-Jones. So that's kind of all that I have to say about that.
I'll also just mention that it's not a zoning fix, but there are some very interesting, yeah, the idea of getting rid of some of the traditional Euclidean formal zones, including R1 zones that prioritizes single family residential as the most exclusive. And then as you add different uses, it's a cumulative map. So in an industrial zone, which is usually the most inclusive zone, you can have residential housing in Euclidean zoning. And so by default, you end up with often either creating or perpetuating environmental justice problems because you have industrial uses right next to housing uses. And that ends up often being the least expensive housing in a jurisdiction. So the idea of kind of cracking off the privilege associated with single family residential as its kind of protected zone is an interesting one. I think that it's interesting to see how that's rolling out around the country, in my opinion. And we're seeing that also with in places like California with mandating the availability of accessory dwelling units like casitas and things like that, saying you have to allow a second unit on the property. Because we need more housing, frankly, and we need to add density, and we're not sure how to do it. So that's an interesting development that I'm curious to see how that goes. And then also, some of you may know it's not a zoning fix, but Evanston, Illinois recently has unrolled a program to try to directly address the economic impact of excluding Blacks and other minorities from federal housing assistance programs like the FHA loans and VA loans. And they have it's got a very controversial name. Some people are calling it a type of reparations, and other people are saying that's an insult to the concept of reparations. We can't call it that. But it's the first attempt that I'm aware of a city saying, look, we know this history happened. We know that there are extremely obvious and egregious differences in wealth and all kinds of other measures that directly flow from this housing mortgage insurance program. We have to do something to try to address it. Here's our first attempt. So that's very interesting, I think, too, to see how that rolls out. And I don't know if size of the city makes it harder or easier. I think, like Michaela said, a lot is probably political will. I'm going to move on to Todd's second question, which is really interesting. It's for Rob. He says, Rob, have you found many individual banks that created their own redlining maps?
They did. I'm confident that they did, though there's no evidence. Like, I've never seen a map actually from a bank. I mean, banks were practicing this before the Hulk made their maps, before the FHA was chartered and started, its redlining practices with mortgage guarantees. And arguably one of the bigger impacts for Hulk is not the maps themselves. The maps themselves, I don't want to get kind of wonky about this, but they didn't make that many copies of them. They kept them pretty heavily controlled and limited access to them to, I think they gave 3 to the FHA in the 40s, but at that point they're probably kind of out of date already. But what they did do is they promoted this as a redlining and their map making techniques. They were actively promoting this as a kind of method that banks should take up, right? So they were making their maps, they were practicing this, and they were developing this methodology for redlining, and they were going out to, in the kind of regulatory capacity or just kind of participation within the real estate industry, and these connections between academia, real estate industry, and government policymakers. They're all tied together and move it. They're same community basically, and they were actively promoting this technique and telling banks, particularly in the midst of the Great Depression, as they were trying to kind of stabilize and juice both the banking industry and the construction industry by trying to restabilize housing credit so that they could start building houses and juice the economy in that respect. They were promoting this methodology and urging banks to make their own apps. So, and undoubtedly they did, but they'll never show them because obviously they probably just got rid of them because they were out of date at certain points. And if they had them, they're not going to show them because it's not a good look for any commercial enterprise to share that. So I never seen one, and I kind of doubt I'll ever see one, but there were undoubtedly named.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Diana, yep, I see your hand. You want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what Rob was saying. Today, we now under the Community Reinvestment Act, banks have to provide data, the HMDA, Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. They have to now publish where they're lending, who they're lending to. And every year there's a lobbyist in Washington, D.C. trying to take down that reporting, those kind of change those reporting requirements, because otherwise we really wouldn't know. And so the catch-22 for this now is that it looks like there's a lot of lending going on in neighborhoods like mine. The question is, what are the demographics of the people they're lending to? Are they creating gentrification by giving loans to white people to move into our neighborhoods? Because the cost of housing sure is going up. So it's kind of a catch-22 there, but we try to keep track of what banks are doing, because the CRA says they have to, Congressional Act of 1977 says they have to lend money for housing and economic development within their delineated service area. They just can't come and collect deposits in our neighborhoods and don't put that money back in the form of not tickets to the opera, not tickets to the isotope games, but hard, fast, trackable lending.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just piggyback on that if I could. Yeah, I think this is really complicated issues that you're raising. So there was a bill that was making its way through the Iowa legislature, and what the bill was the first bill I think I'd seen that used the whole maps and wrote those into some legislation. And the legislation was essentially kind of it was offered as some kind of way of offering restitution or repair or reparations, or just repairing the damage of redlining, and saying that that there would be some tax abatements on properties where more than a quarter where there was improvements that raised the value of the home by at least 25% in formerly redlined neighborhoods, specifically mentioning Holk. But this was, this is not. This is about gentrifying those neighborhoods. When you're talking about a quarter, right? This is about like making sure that wealthy developers and predominantly white, or at least middle class gentrifiers can go in there and get tax abatements. This is something that's pretty hard for many residents in lower income, middle income communities to take advantage of. Yeah, I had another thought, but and then same thing with climate, right? Like I think Elizabeth has mentioned health disparities and environmental inequities in these redline neighborhoods, and it's a really complicated thing to tackle. You can put parks in these, you can green these, but then you risk climate gentrification happening. So there are no easy answers to these problems, and it requires the kind of constant vigilance and work that Diane's doing.
Excellent. Reed, do you have a?
Yeah, well, the answers you've just been giving get to the question of, for states or localities that want to try to undo some of the ongoing damage from the historic redlining and racially restricted, what's working?
So Reed's question was, for the states and localities that want to try to undo the damage that's kind of calcified over time, what strategies are working in undoing that? And I'll add on to that, based on our discussion of CRA lending and some of the missteps. what is not necessarily, what has had unintended negative consequences or made things even worse. So those are fantastic questions. So that kind of continues the discussion that we were having, but maybe we'll add on to it other types of tools, whether they be financial tools or tax incentives or zoning, something like that. So
Yeah. I'll just say, I feel like we've talked kind of a little bit about the zoning approach. So I'm really interested in the answers that aren't zoning, but if I think of anything we haven't mentioned in terms of zoning, I'll certainly pipe up, but I'd like to defer to Rob and Diana first.
I don't have good answers to that. I mean, I think I pointed some of the things we're talking about, eliminating single family zoning, some of the kind of local reparations or reparations-ish. Evanston's one, Asheville's another one that's exploring some of these. A lot of these are happening at the local level, at the federal level. I mean, there's some interesting environmental justice efforts. What is it called? Something 40, where 40% of environmental justice funds are directed towards lower income neighborhoods. Justice 40, I think it might be called. Yeah, you know, there's a lot of work, and I think what I'd emphasize is we're talking about you know, half century, 75, 3/4 of a century, more than that, of discrimination in the real estate market that takes a long time to undo, right? And there's going to be multiple strategies. I mean, we talked about a few things here: restrictive covenants, redlining, zoning. You know, you can add a million things about highway construction. I was talking about school zoning. You know, there's a lot of work that has to be done because these have all reinforced one another and calcified privilege in some places and vulnerability in other places. And it's no simple task. It takes decades of concerted policy work to undo this. And I mean, frankly, it's hard for me to feel particularly optimistic about this, given the state of polarization in this country. I mean, I think you have to fight the fight as best you can, but it's a hard fight.
I would agree with Rob on that. And every community looks different. And so assessments have to be done based on the community that you're working in, because every community is different in their thoughts and how their cultural, the way they live culturally is different. So there's not one size that fits all. But I do think that one of the things I know that's happening in our neighborhoods is that there is a study going on to look at how to allocate some dollars that our neighborhoods fought to get back. And it was designated to housing and economic development. And the research is showing that money's being made in our neighborhoods, but it's not being made by the residents. So who's making the money off the real estate? So I would like to see, we are concerned about high density, okay? The high density housing that wants to come into our neighborhoods, because some density is fine and high density belongs on certain corridors, but it doesn't belong in all the little neighborhoods where there's a little casita and then there's a 12-foot historic thing peering down in the backyard. That changes culturally a whole lot. And some people don't understand that, but it does. But I would like to see opportunities for maybe duplexes or fourplexes that can be owned by someone who lives in one and rents the others out, thereby generating some family income and allowing elderly people to age in place in smaller dwellings, a fourplex or a duplex, and still be able to stay in a neighborhood like ours. Quickly, people in our neighborhoods are being, pushed out. I paid $64,000 for my house in South Broadway. 2 doors down, just sold for $200,000. Now, some people say, "Oh, that's great, Don, you got equity." No, I'm at risk of losing my neighborhood and neighbors who can't afford it. And that scares the holy heck out of me, because if everybody here from New Mexico knows Sandy Presley, #1 realtor in the state of New Mexico, when her sign goes up in your area, you might as well say you just bring in the Starbucks too, because your neighborhood's going to change. And that's exactly what happened with that property. And I remember the family that lived there years and years ago. It's changing our neighborhood. We have to create those kind of incentives and programs that are specific to neighborhoods like ours.
Yeah, I'll just name two. we're on fears now. I know you're looking for solutions, but two things that I'm kind of watching. One was the feds, and probably I'm going to defer to which department, but under Trump said that discriminatory housing is only when you mean it, and not when it just happens to have discriminatory impacts on the ground. That takes everything we just talked about tonight and throws it out the window, right? Because unless you can show the map that shows the red line and says on it, no blacks here, what these days has that kind of on the face discrimination baked in? Very, very little. I mean, I think if you look at city council transcripts, you might find more, but it's very little that's actually written or mapped, right? And so if we continue to say it has to be de jure and not de facto, then we can't fix anything. So I think we need to keep an eye on that. And then the other one that I saw again under the last administration was you can't put any more, there was kind of a shift of how you can use your federal money that was supposed to support the Fair Housing Act, which is supposed to balance, this discrimination that happens in housing practices. And they just shifted and took power away from the localities to say it's appropriate here and it's appropriate here and it's not appropriate there, and kind of said, you shall put your money here and not there. And I think that, like Diana Durham-Jones was mentioning, we know better what's appropriate in terms of adding to density or adding to the housing mix in a particular neighborhood as opposed to others. And having that kind of top-down approach, and here's how you're going to spend your federal funds, I think is kind of problematic.
Excellent. To summarize all of that, Reed, I think we need to think more about the positives, the positive solutions, and less about the, oh man, there are so many potential solutions that have not worked out well or have negative, yeah. So good question, excellent question for the evening. Let's see, we have time for one more question if anybody has one that they'd like to ask of our panelists. I'll ask one if there's time. One thing that I was really interested in kind of exploring in this is making sure that and this is what's so cool about the Mapping Inequality project, is that GIS mapping creates the possibilities, these visual representations that are just jaw-dropping. You could read and write an entire article about something, an academic article, and it may not have the same gut punch as looking at a GIS map that shows an overlay of Hulk redlining in a community and what are today food deserts or places where kids don't have enough to eat or something. So I wondered if anybody on our panel, and Rob, I think the Mapping Inequality project may have tackled this to some degree, can talk about some of those comparison maps that you've been able to generate to show what the discrimination looks like today, what the effects of the discrimination are in our maps today.
Sure, I'll briefly comment on that. So this is not just work that we've done, but this is work that lots of people have done with the data set that we released, which is to look for the statistical associations or the correlations between the redlining grades and like basically any measure of inequality you want to measure and can measure in American cities today. So a lot of those have revolved around health. I was speaking at the Interdisciplinary Association of Population Health Studies this morning on a panel that was about systemic racism and redlining and its relationship to health disparities. We did a project on this with the NCRC, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and they match up. I mean, and then really visualizing it is particularly powerful, not just looking at things like the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index, which if you map the Social Vulnerability Index and sit it next side by side with the Hulk map, they look remarkably similar. But then you could dig a little deeper into that. You see that similarity disparity, those differences in grades correlate to like often like a 12-year difference in lifespan between a red-lined neighborhood and what was a green-lined neighborhood. People have done this with school performance. They've done this with where supermarkets and convenience stores are located. It's actually kind of interesting. Like, you know, I think I now take to using the term food apartheid. But food desert's another term that's often used that naturalizes this access to food. And if you, I started mapping this, and I was actually kind of surprised that red line neighborhoods and green line neighborhoods actually both are pretty distant from where supermarkets are. But the difference is that green line neighborhoods, you know, the people are well-to-do and they have cars and they can you know, have Whole Foods deliver the food to their door, and they just have, it's just not as much of a nightmare for them to get those access to healthy foods because they have ready access to transportation and have resources to have that food brought to them, which is obviously not the case in many lower income neighborhoods. Anyways, I'm going on, but I agree with you. I mean, this is like the one one reason I'm doing other work on other maps of American history, but I spend probably 75% of my time talking or thinking or writing about redlining, and it is because Elizabeth's absolutely right. Like, this is kind of caught on because it has a kind of instantaneous, it's like undeniable that this is a kind of just a clear and straightforward example of systemic racism in American housing policy, and it's sponsored by the government, and the maps can be so easily correlated with inequalities today, which is not to say that redlining causes inequalities. That's obviously kind of a facile, simplistic thing to say. But the redlining maps really are kind of a pretty good proxy for systemic racism in 20th century governmental and market policies, and that systemic racism, you know, arguably does cause inequality.
I'll just add on to that excellent answer with more than kind of a tool of a visual tool to kind of get that gut impact. We're also really excited in the planning world to have those maps for analysis for what to do about any of this, which was the open question that we just tried to answer. But the Office of Equity and Inclusion has a version of a social vulnerability index map that is now being shared around the city. The planning department's working on a disparity map that would also kind of pick some built environment factors that we want to look at as we work with communities on how to get them closer to their vision for their own communities. And so that, you know, GIS analysis tool, not so much showing the redlining, but showing the effects of the ongoing institutional racism that's still happening, to think about with communities, how do we change the tide?
Fantastic. Okay, we're a few minutes over, but I wanted to just give one more round of applause to our presenters. Thank you so very much to Diana Dorn-Jones, especially our superhero of the evening. Michaela Wren-Switmore and Rob Nelson, thank you and to all of you, thank you very much for being with us and online as well. Thanks, this was great. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you.